It's time to hit social media for cash tags. For that, we'd like to welcome in Andy Swan, the co-founder of LikeFolio.com, and we have Jenny Horn, fast market contributor, with us as well. I know we're going to be talking Delta Airlines because they have earnings coming out, but you look at this one, it's just as much an oil story as it is a consumer happiness story, and I know that's what LikeFolio and Andy are going to focus in on.
Absolutely, and this is a company we always talk about has very strong consumer happiness, which could be correlated to the fact that of the airline sector, it is the best performing. So they were up 22% in 2019, and their happiness is good. I mean, you look at a chart, they're $4 off highs, but they're in a pretty good place into earnings, and it seems like we blinked and we're back in earnings season. I feel like we just had earnings. I'm not complaining, I love earnings.
We were just doing Nike, weren't we just doing Nike?
Yes, we were just doing Nike.
Go.
I know, now we're back with the banks, but of course, Delta has earnings pre-market tomorrow. So Andy, what are you seeing with Delta's data?
Well, if I look giddy, it's because we're back in earnings season. That was a really long 3.5 weeks. I mean, we shouldn't have to deal with that. So with Delta, what I'm going to say is, look, there's a lot that goes into the performance of Delta as a company and the stock that we can't see at LikeFolio. So we focus in on, how happy are the consumers that fly these airlines? How likely are they to be loyal long term? And for us, it's Delta and Southwest that are head and shoulders above the rest in a very big way. And what we see when we look at this is a pretty consistent trajectory for both of these. In fact, I think Delta has probably the advantage long term. They've just announced that I believe within the next year, they're looking at free Wi-Fi for all passengers, which could be a real game changer. It's kind of like how Southwest has no change fees and no baggage fees. Well, on Delta, you're getting a more premium experience with free Wi-Fi included in your flight. And so for us, long term, those are the two companies that we think will do the best. They have the best relationship with their consumer. But like Kevin said, this week may be all about the outlook of oil and energy costs, which are a big, big factor in analysis of Delta stock.
Andy, so this is the most timely conversation ever, as I'm just getting back from vacation. And so I've said it before on the show, but in case people haven't heard, I fly Southwest. I couldn't remember the last time I hadn't flown Southwest until this past trip. And I don't want to be the person who's complaining, but I'm just contrasting experiences. I flew American Airlines, and I couldn't say that I am completely in line with what this chart is showing in terms of the difference between the services, because they really are just completely different. And so I'm not saying one's better or one's different or one's or worse than the other, but the one thing I will say is the Southwest employees just seem to be a little bit nicer, a little bit happier than the American Airlines employees, and that probably impacts their consumer happiness to some extent. But when you're looking at Delta, why is Delta able to outperform United and American the way that it has? Is there a similar model in terms of how the boarding process works, how the ticketing works, where Southwest is almost on its own island? It's completely different in terms of how they do business.
Yeah, I think a lot. Well, part of it comes down to the fact that Delta does not have these 737 Maxes, which has held back a lot of the others in terms of people talking about who they won't fly or what they're fearful of. But beyond that, I think Delta does deliver on a better experience consistently. They do a better job when you're on the plane. They do a much better job throughout the booking and arrival process, I think, for most consumers. And so the way that we see it is, look, most of the time when people take to social media about an airline, it's to complain. And so these are naturally suppressed numbers. And so for Delta and for Southwest to be anywhere near 60% positive is a real accomplishment. And we think that continues well into 2020. We see no signs of shifting in terms of that potential consumer loyalty going forward.
The biggest complaint that I have about Delta Airlines is the fact that Chicago-based people, which is we all are, really don't get the benefit of Delta. Because they're a hub more in the south, like Atlanta, and they go to the south where we don't really get that. We're United, American and Southwest out of our Midway airport. So we don't get that effect of flying Delta very often, unless you're going, way to the Caribbean and south like that. Sometimes you do it. But yeah, so all this love that Delta gets, we really don't get here based in the Midwest.
We really don't, but
No.
I have to say I looked up delays specifically then with Delta's cash tag, and it seemed like no matter what, I looked for bad stuff, I looked for all sorts of noise. It seemed like no matter what I put in, people were still really happy with Delta. Even after this past weekend, which we had some kind of inclement weather, people still really were like praising Delta, praising the fact that none of their flights got delayed, which was a small miracle, because if you ever searched the cash tag any of these airlines, everybody complained.
I think 1,000 flights got canceled Saturday out of Chicago. So guess what? Delta's barely in Chicago, so that probably really affected their numbers.
So maybe their hub in Atlanta is good because they have good weather in Atlanta. But our first tweet is from John Ross, who says, Delta Airlines earnings coming soon. If good and economy keeps humming, chart setup argues for a 6% move by February to test high. That would bode well for long-term uptrend in 2020. So with these airlines, of course, the sector moves typically together. If one moves, they all kind of move. Do you think this could be a barometer for the overall health of the consumer? Because if the consumer is healthy, they're going to be flying.
I don't think you can always put the health of the consumer in the airlines.
Okay.
I think it's tricky. I think the biggest thing about airlines is the capacity word. That is such a big stock mover for these names, and it's the reverse of what you think it would be. Added capacity is very bearish, because it's like you connect the dots to price wars, where less capacity is actually bullish for all these names. Now, crude oil, gasoline prices, that's another factor. But in my trading of these names and looking at these names, capacity is the biggest single factor in trading these stocks.
And building on that, Andy, you mentioned something too, and we kind of dusted over it in terms of the 737 MAX story, and whether or not that comes to a conclusion in the nearer term and the longer term, we do not know. But when you're looking at this, the one thing that is for certain is that Delta wasn't exposed to that. The longer that this story drags on and the uncertainty around Boeing and that particular aircraft, you would think that has to be at least a positive for Delta. Whether or not it's a negative for Southwest or the other airlines that are invested in that particular aircraft remains to be seen. But when Delta just basically can say, we're not involved in this story at all, that has to be positive, right?
Yeah, I think it is positive, and I think it's probably already priced into the stock. I mean, it's a really well-known thing that Delta is not experiencing these problems and is experiencing a competitive advantage because they're not. I will say that our data on purchase intent volume around airline tickets is showing a little bit slower growth than we would have anticipated, given the economy and so on. So I think that there is at least some possibility that Delta and some of these others come out and talk about increased capacity as we go into these earnings calls. So for us, it's, we're pretty neutral going into this one, but if anything, we would lean bearish directionally.
Remember, you are talking about 10 months that this Boeing 737 MAX issue has been out there.
The year anniversary. Yeah. But I have to say, I feel like we'll talk about this Boeing story for years, because Southwest has the greatest exposure in their fleet.
34.
And they're the second best performing airline in the past year. So Southwest hasn't cared. I mean, of course, Delta is doing the best and they have no exposure. But I have to say that it seems like the 737 MAX headwinds haven't been as terrible for these airlines as everybody anticipated, which is just wild to me. So our next tweet is from Vincent Crook, who says, I was pleasantly surprised by Delta Airlines today. Although we have had a long delay, they have brought us out sandwiches, chips, and drinks for everyone. They've also gone out of their way to make sure everyone got what they needed for waiting. So again, I searched delays and Delta.
Who hands out sandwiches? Whoa!
And I got nothing but happy customers. Yeah. So this goes kind of directly into what you're seeing, Andy. I mean, it seems like this, I don't know what they're doing, but whatever they're doing it well, because even typing in delay, I still got really positive noise this morning.
Yeah, I think you hit on something there. I think that Delta's the one out of the four airlines that we talked about today that's doing the best job of mitigating those things that they can't control. And so when there are delays, there are weather problems, that sort of thing, they're going out of their way in a much more concerted and intentional fashion to make those customers happy while they're sitting there in the airport, and helping them with the rebooking process in a way that American and United just don't. It's like when you get on American and United, you feel like you're getting on a Greyhound bus, and when you book with Delta, you feel like you have at least some personal touch. And I think that's what's setting them apart from a consumer happiness and loyalty perspective.
No, Andy, and building on that, it seems like they're definitely a company that's aware of that premium service that they're offering and continuing almost to go out of their way to emphasize that in times where things are out of their control, because, that is a time where, people are trying to get home to their families, or they have a big conference they got to go to where they're upset, and anything you can do as one of these companies to kind of minimize that damage is only going to benefit them long term, even if it's at a cost. But, coming back to your outlook going forward and around this earnings, everything seems to be clicking strong for Delta. This is just a more of a valuation call for you, and directionally leaning a little bit bearish just simply off of the performance that you've seen over the last year.
Yeah, that's right. And I think long term, this is one of the best of breed in the sector. And so if you're forced to, or if you actually want to own an airline, then Delta's probably a pretty good look, on any dips. And so that's the way I would think about it. Not the greatest industry probably long term, but I think you always need to know who's best of breed, and Delta's definitely in that category.
All righty, Andy, great stuff. We'll leave it there. Thanks to Jenny as well.